Hello and welcome. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Deputy Editor at ThePrint, and I'm going to talk to you about my latest column in my standard deviation series titled GDP Data Shows How Well Nirmala Sitharaman Handled the Pandemic Economy, Critics Judged Too Soon. The GDP data released last week is important not just because it gives us new insight into the pandemic and post-pandemic years, but also because of what it says about how India and its leadership navigated the economic fallout in that difficult period. With the benefit of hindsight and more data, it turns out that Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman has indeed been very competent in how she has steered the Indian economy through the turbulence of the pandemic and beyond. Her critics would do well to be fair and take note. Typically, the cycle of GDP data involves 6 stages. The first advanced estimates for a financial year are released in January of that year and incorporate about 9 months of data, which is from the April to December period. The second advanced estimates are released in February and add 1 more month to the data being examined. At the end of the financial year, provisional estimates are released based on data for the entire year. As the title suggests, this data is still provisional and doesn't include deeper elements like how the informal sector did or any other key data sets such as the annual survey of industries, which includes granular information on individual sectors. A year down the line, the government releases the first revised estimates, which incorporate wider and more accurate data, and 2 years later, the second revised estimates. It's only after 3 years that we get the final third revised estimates. If you go to the bottom of the press release issued by the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation on the GDP data, which was released on Feb 28, you'll find the various additional sources of information that have been used to arrive at each year's revised estimates. This is a normal cycle followed every year. However, the impact of the pandemic on the economy has meant that the revisions made to the data for 2020-21 and 21-22 in particular are even more significant than usual. Now, as we know, 2021 and 21-22 featured the nationwide lockdown and sporadic regional lockdowns. These severely curtailed the ability of the government to collect data during these years. So, for those 2 years, the word provisional has taken on a heavier emphasis than in normal years. Now, before going into what the revised data shows, I should add a caveat that I was part of the Finance Minister's team from January 2020 to August 2022. So, to prevent any allegations of partiality, this analysis is only going to focus on the dry GDP data put out by the government in the public domain, with any analysis limited to just those numbers. The second revised estimates for 2020-21 show that the contraction in India's GDP was less severe than initially thought. The provisional estimates for the year pegged the contraction at 7.3%. Then the first revised estimates pegged it at 6.6%. The second revised estimates, which is the latest data we have for the year, put the contraction for the pandemic impacted year at an even milder 5.8%. It is unlikely that this revision was made for the first half of the year when the nationwide lockdown was in effect. What this implies is that the recovery in economic activity once the lockdown was eased was faster than we initially thought. While a part of this was due to pent-up demand and supply catching up, it's also a strong positive statement on the efficacies of the government's policies to mitigate the initial disruption. Clearly, businesses were in a position to jump back into action. Also, those people who needed aid received enough aid to ensure that consumption didn't sag too badly. For the next year, that is FY22, the first revised estimates, which is again the latest data that we have for that year, pegged India's GDP growth at 9.1%, up from the 8.7% which were predicted in the provisional estimates. This too is very significant. Typically, all other things remaining the same, a revision of a base year upwards means that growth in the subsequent year comes down. In such a scenario, the upward revision in growth for 2020-21 should have meant that 2021-22 growth would have been revised downwards, but it was nevertheless revised upwards. This means that the bounce back from the first year of the pandemic was quite a bit stronger than initially thought. Again, a lot of the credit goes to the government. There are likely to be many who will question the veracity of the government's data and the revisions that have taken place. However, it is important to be consistent with such criticism. If the government's data gathering, processing, and presenting process is suspect when it comes to the GDP numbers, then those same allegations should hold true for other government data as well, such as the 2019 report that said India's unemployment rate was at a 45-year high, or that consumer demand fell for the first time in 40 years. If bad news is accepted unquestioningly, then so should the good news be. Conversely, the bad news should be examined as vigorously as the good news is. Nirmala Sitharaman has been dealt a pretty bad hand from the start of her term as finance minister. Within about 9 months of assuming charge, she had to deal with a global pandemic that required an unprecedented level of quick thinking and action. As the effects of COVID-19 on the economy began to wear off by 2022, India was struck by a double whammy of skyrocketing oil prices because of the Russia-Ukraine war and a global demand slump because of a near recessionary developed world. Sitharaman still has about 15 months left of her term as finance minister, unless of course the cabinet is reshuffled, which is highly unlikely. There's much to still address, such as a continued contraction in the manufacturing sector, a private sector still reluctant to invest, and a seemingly intractable unemployment problem. However, what is also clear is that her handling of the pandemic and its after effects has been eminently capable and should go a long way in silencing her critics. It's all there in the data. That's all I have for you this time. Thank you so much for watching.